Today, I want to deal with this infographic. It says ESV publishes gross error with regards to Psalm 10, verse 4 and 5, or really verse 5. This is produced by Jack McElroy. He's the author of several King James Version only books. One of his books, Can You Trust Just One Bible?, contains lists of answers to the most common anti-King James Version accusations. And I would point out that it is not answers to the most common anti-King James Version onlyist accusations, but rather a book that wrongly supposes people are averse to the King James Version itself. Now, McElroy has another book called Which Bible Would Jesus Use? The Bible Controversy Explained and Resolved. He has another book called Bible Versions Exposed, which has over 400 blockbuster editorial memes that you can use to demonstrate the shocking truth about modern Bible versions, their errors, deficiency, and defective doctrines. That's where you can find this infographic, or as he likes to call it, a meme. And on behalf of all of us who live on memes, I can tell you, this is not a meme, but we'll save that rant for another day. Several King James Version onlyists drop these graphics from this book on me almost nonstop. They demand that I deal with every single one of these. And when I do, they get mad at me and tell me I've taken something out of context or I'm just a Bible corrector. But let's take a minute and examine this one in particular. This one is on Psalm 10, verses 4 and 5. And it reads, ESV publishes gross error. Then it goes on to point out the difference in Psalm 10, verse 5 in the King James Version and the ESV. The King James Version says, his ways are always grievous, talking about the wicked person. The ESV says his ways prosper at all times. And then we get to the criticism. Anyone over the age of 30 has been around the block enough to know that the ways of the wicked do not prosper at all times. How can Christian leaders who know so much be so wrong in their choice and recommendation of the defective ESV? So what I want to do today is dig in and let's see if the ESV is really defective in Psalm 10 verse 5. I really hope you'll stay tuned for all of this video. If you're a King James Version onlyist who believes that the King James Version is a perfect preservation of the Greek Textus Receptus and the Hebrew Masoretic text, you definitely want to see this video. If you're a Ruckmanite, nothing I am going to say will matter. None of the evidence I'm going to show you will make any difference. And because if you believe the King James Version is perfect based on faith alone and nothing else, then don't even bother looking at the evidence. But if you believe the King James Version perfectly preserves the Hebrew and Greek for the English-speaking people, then hold on. This might sting a bit. Let's go to Logos. Here in Logos, we have the King James Version and the ESV. Let's compare the two. Verse number 5 in the King James Version. His ways are always grievous. Thy judgments are far above, out of his sight. As for all his enemies, he puffeth at them. Let's look at verse number 5 in the English Standard Version. His ways prosper at all times. Your judgments are on high, out of his sight. As for all his foes, he puffs at them. So the difference there is in the King James, it says, his ways are always grievous. In the ESV, his ways prosper at all times, which is correct. Of course, those are contradictory terms. They cannot both be grievous and prosper at the, well, I guess they could, but that's not what the text is saying. The text is saying that he prospers. It seems like the wicked prospers in the ESV, and the other says that they're just grievous. So one comment that I've seen is from someone who said, okay, I'm a businessman. I'm going to put this on a poster in my business and use it as inspiration because whatever I do, I can be as wicked as I want to because they're going to prosper and I'm going to prosper at all times. So what they've done is taken that verse completely out of context. Let's look at the context of Psalm 10. Now, let's step into this. Verse number 1, why standest thou afar off, O Lord? Well, why hidest thou thyself in times of trouble? Let's take that same logic and let's apply it to these verses that we're going to look at here. Does the Lord really stand afar off? Does he really hide himself in times of trouble? No, this is poetic language by the psalmist David, who is complaining about the wicked to the Lord. Verse number 2, the wicked in his pride persecutes the poor, doth persecute the poor. Let them be taken in the devices that they have imagined. For the wicked boasteth of his heart's desire, and blesseth the covetous whom the Lord abhorreth. Now, verse number 4, it starts to get interesting. The wicked through the pride of his countenance will not seek after God, not in all his thoughts. His ways are always grievous. Now look at this. Thy judgments are far above out of his sight. As for all of his enemies, he puffs at them. He has said in his heart, I shall not be moved. Look, for I shall never be in adversity. Is it true that the wicked will never be in adversity? Is it true that they will never deal with the judgment of God because it's far above out of his sight? No, he's going to be judged. The Bible says it's appointed unto man once to die, and after this, the judgment. But what we see here is language given by the psalmist as he pours his heart out to God. And he talks about how their eyes are set against the poor, or the wicked person sits in the lurking places, in the villages and secret places. He murders the innocent. He's full of cursing, deceit, and fraud. We look at all these things and we can see that David is speaking about them. He is not preaching against them. He is going to God on his own behalf, speaking about the negativity or the vanity, the wickedness of these people in Psalm 10. Now, as we compare the King James Version to the ESV, we do see that there's a big difference there between being grievous and his ways prospering. And so let's compare this with other versions and see that it's really not just a problem with the ESV, if there is a problem at all. In the King James, obviously, his ways are always grievous. In the LSB, his ways prosper at all times. In the ESV, we've already seen this, his ways prosper at all times. The NASB, his ways succeed at all times. But look at the New King James. And the New King James is based off of the same Hebrew and Greek text as the King James Version. His ways are always prospering. That one concerns me. Why, if the King James Version stays true to the Masoretic text and the Greek Textus Receptus, why is the New King James different and in agreement with these other versions in this place when, if they are both true to the same Hebrew text, they should read the same here? I would expect the New King James to say that his ways are always grievous, but it doesn't. Let's find out why. So let's go, obviously, Old Testament, let's go to the Hebrew. In verse number 5, we have here, his ways are always grievous, his ways are always something. So we have Yahilu right here, Yahilu Darku, Yahilu Darko, Bakal it. So prosperous, his ways at all times. So his ways are prosperous at all times. Why can I say that? Yahilu, why do I say that means prosperous and not grievous? Well, if we pull up the lexicon, we see that heal means to strengthen or to endure. And so we clearly see that that is the root of Yahilu, and this is talking about being strong or firm, not being grievous. There is nothing here that portrays anything other than strength or force. The Hebrew does not say or does not give us reason to translate or interpret grievous here in this verse. Now, if grievous doesn't come from the Hebrew, where does it come from? Let's go to the Latin Vulgate. And I know somebody's going to get mad at me now, but we're going to do it anyway. So if we look in verse number 26 of the Vulgate in Psalm 9, and I think this is important to note that in the Vulgate and in the Septuagint, Psalm 10 and Psalm 9 are combined. So Psalm 10:5 actually shows up in Psalm 9:26 in the Vulgate. And so we have the word inquinitai right here, which is the word, let me get rid of that. I double-clicked on it, sorry. So that word inquinitai does not mean prosper. What does it mean? Well, let's pull that over and let's look at the dictionary for inquino, the root of that, to befoul, stain, pollute, or defile. This is a word that means to pollute or to profane. The King James Version, his ways are always grievous, does not come from the Hebrew Masoretic text, it comes from the Latin Vulgate. Now, where did the Latin Vulgate get it from? Because it did not get it from the Hebrew Masoretic text. So where did Jerome get this from? Well, let's go to the Septuagint. And in the Septuagint, we have here bebe luntai, hi idoi, autu in pate kairo. And what we see here is his ways are grievous or profane in all things or in all times. Now, when we look at bebe luntai means to cause highly revered to become identified with the commonplace, to violate sanctity, to desecrate, to profane the Sabbath. It means to profane or to pollute. That's what bebelao means. Now, why do I give you this? This is so important. As you can see, the King James Version does not stay faithful to the Masoretic Hebrew text in Psalm 10:5. It leaves the Hebrew in favor of the Latin Vulgate and the Greek Septuagint. In doing this, the King James Version disagrees with the traditional Hebrew Old Testament, and it disagrees from every modern English version because the translators chose to follow Jerome in this passage. Why do I point this out? Because so many that are King James Version onlyists say that it is a perfect preservation of the Hebrew text, when it's not. It cannot perfectly preserve the Hebrew if it uses a reading that's not in the Hebrew. Not only is it not in the Hebrew text, but the rendering that they chose contradicts what is in the Hebrew. Now, here's where every King James Version onlyist has to make a decision. Do you stick with your statement that the King James Version perfectly preserves the original and Greek or Hebrew and Greek text, even though I've just shown you that it doesn't? If you're willing to be intellectually honest, you must admit that the King James Version doesn't preserve perfectly the Hebrew text. If you're to remain King James Version only, you need a new argument. If you're using an ESV or any modern English version, you can now know that the version you hold in your hand is faithful to the Hebrew and Psalm 10 in verse number 5. Now, what blows my mind is that people like McElroy, Grady, who wrote the foreword for one of his books, and others like them will make these accusations without looking it up. It would be different if their position was that the King James Version corrects Hebrew and Greek, but they argue that it is a perfect preservation. And that's simply not the case.